Good evening and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam and I'll be your moderator. Tonight we're welcoming Tom Snyder back with us for another webinar. Tom is the Senior Director of Henry Schein's Professional Practice Transition Team, and tonight he'll be covering 2022 practice transitions and if next year is the year to sell your practice. If there are any questions, please type them into the Q&A section of your control panel and we'll get back to you via email within 2 business days. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation, live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute. Tom, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I think you'll find the topic tonight to be a pretty interesting one. Is 2022 the the year when you're going to sell your dental practice? So tonight, we're going to cover a lot of ground. This is only 4 of the topics that I'll be covering. First of all, we'll learn how practice valuations will be conducted in 2022, because obviously the pandemic had a big impact on how we value our dental practices. We'll talk a little bit about bank lending and how banks have changed some of their guidelines. We'll talk about using a broker if you're thinking of selling your practice. We'll also talk about key elements of a practice purchase agreement, plus a few other items which I think you'll find of interest. For those of you who may have attended one of my seminars over the last year and a half, you might remember this slide where we would talk about the impact of the pandemic on the dental profession. And I constantly cited data that was accumulated by the American Dental Association's Health Policy Institute. And they used to offer biweekly and then monthly releases of information, and it was quite impactful. And we're going to cover a few items tonight to see where we are as of August 16th. I think most of you would agree that the rebound from the pandemic has been better than maybe most of us thought. Most recent data shows that patient volume is at 89% of pre-pandemic levels. And I can tell you, because we value lots of dental practices, that many practitioners were actually ahead of that percentage as it relates to pre-pandemic, which would be in 2019. Obviously, for most practitioners, economic confidence is very high. However, there is one major challenge that we're finding throughout the country, and that's staffing. Big problem in finding dental team members, particularly dental assistants and hygienists. And I don't think that it's going to change in the foreseeable future. Having said that, though, there's lots of positive signs for Q4 as the dental sector continues to pick up steam. And this is especially true with your current patients. Many patients coming back after not being in for recare for maybe a year or a year and a half, lots of treatment that needs to be rendered, and that most patients are feeling pretty darn comfortable about going to the dentist. Another interesting fact is it's still a seller's market, as we'll talk a little bit about later on about valuations. We're finding that practice values continue to remain high, as many practices, of course, have rebounded from 2020 or exceeded their pre-pandemic levels. As far as practice sales, demand for quality practice is as strong as ever, and there are many potential purchasers who have been sitting on the sidelines waiting to buy something. So very good practices don't stay on the market very long. And as we'll talk about in a minute or two, bank lending is also very strong, and interest rates continue to remain low. Now, this information I thought just was released recently again by the American Dental Association's Health Policy Institute. And what they looked at is how did practitioners do regarding net income to 2019 versus 2020. And for general practitioners, they took the biggest hit. Their average income, net income, was down 17.9%. But for general practitioners, it was about 6.9%. So obviously, when the offices were closed 1, 2, or 3 months, it's readily apparent, even though there was PPP money about, that net incomes did drop. But I think many of you have seen a strong rebound in 2021. There's something I want to spend a minute or two on, because there was some trends that we saw from the ADA studies back in March and April of 2020, where questions were asked, especially older doctors, if in fact you didn't do as well in 2020 as you did in 2019, what steps would you take? And at that time, about 25% of those doctors over the age of 65 said that they would consider retiring or selling their practice in 2021. 25%. And as you can see here, this bar graph represents about 32,000 dentists. So that's a large number of dentists. But what we found this past year, because obviously we're in the business of valuing practices and brokering them, that we didn't have that surge of doctors in that age group selling. As a matter of fact, as the ADA kept tracking doctors in that age group, the percentages were the normal attrition, which is a couple of percent a year. So what does that possibly mean? Well, it could well be some of you taking this webinar might have been a recipient of the survey and may have responded that you were going to take some action. But what happened in 2021? As we began to rebound, doctors whose income was down, especially GPs, saw 2021 as a year to maybe get some of that income back. Or from a valuation point of view, many doctors felt, you know what? I'm really doing better than I thought. I think I'm going to hold on for another year and see what happens, beginning of 2022. So consequently, this is a year and a half, 2 years later. As many of you know, the average retirement age is about 69.4. So will 2022 see a larger percentage of doctors in that age group finally taking action because they've kind of gotten back to where they were or close to where they were pre-pandemic, made a few more dollars, maybe put a few more dollars away, and all obviously are hoping to get a higher value than had they sold it earlier. So I think all those elements are contributors to why those numbers were off. The new generation of dental graduates have some very interesting traits. We found that for those dentists under the age of 35, only 1 in 5 desire to be a solo practitioner. And think about the fact that we're just about 50% of practitioners who still practice that way. There are some ramifications which I'll touch on in a minute. This group of dental graduates are 3 times more likely to seek employment in large groups when they were 10 years ago. And obviously, with the emergence of DSOs and large group practice networks, we find that to be true. Because of the indebtedness of our graduates, many of them feel they've got to work for a while before they consider ownership. That may or may not necessarily be a true statement, but it's just a reality that they see in front of their eyes right now. Obviously, this generation is extremely high tech and computer literate, so they shy away from practices that really are not up to date with technology. And that could have an implication, of course, if your practice is not very high tech and you wanted to sell it, you may find there'll be some big discounting going on. And also, this group of dentists, more than others, prefer urban and suburban versus small town or rural areas. So let me talk to those solo practitioners who might be practicing in small towns or rural areas. If only 1 in 5 under the age of 35 are desirous of a solo practitioner, and that's your practice model, unfortunately, you're going to have some major challenges. It always was difficult to sell practices in small towns or rural areas, but because of this preponderance of doctors who do not want to practice in a solo mode, that really has some major ramifications. So I think you have to be realistic about your retirement strategy as far as selling your practice. That just may not happen, unfortunately. So let's chat for a minute about practice values. Obviously, many of us thought that we really weren't sure what the impact of the pandemic was going to have on dental practice values, but suffice it to say, it hasn't been what we thought. As a matter of fact, looking at general practices across the country, we're still seeing the majority of sales between 70 to 85% of prior year's gross revenue. Now, does that mean your practice could be worth less? Yes. Could it be worth more? Yes. And we'll talk in a minute about what the contributing factors may be to that variance in ratios. And for those specialists in the audience, they range a little higher than what they've been. We're finding that oral and maxillofacial surgeons between 68 to 72, ortho 70 to 83, pedo 70 to 80, and sometimes higher if it's a pedo-ortho combination. Endo between 68, 71%, Perio 60 to 68, and Pros 60 to 67. Now, does that mean that's what your practice is worth? No, it is a range of value. It's a realistic expectation of what you may get on the market. You could get a higher number or a lower number. Again, uh, as you know, since we value close to 700 practices a year, because we say we think your practice is worth X, that may or may not be what you're going to get. And I think you have to look at it from the standpoint of evaluation is done to help you, if you're selling, set a fair purchase price on the open market. Now, we've talked about this before, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to refresh your memory, we use 3 different valuation methods to determine the value of your dental practice. Market approach simply looks at comparative sales statistics. What did practices sell for in a particular market? What was the goodwill value of those sold practices? What was their profit margin? So we come up with a value, a range of value. Income approach is the one that's most commonly used, particularly by CPAs when they value dental practices for their clients. We're looking at are the true earnings of the practice, because at the end of the day, that's what you're purchasing. And that's frankly what the large groups and DSOs are looking at. What kind of cash flow or profit can I get if I make an investment in your practice? The third method looks at your assets. What is your goodwill value worth? And what are the value of your tangible assets, your equipment, leaseholds if applicable, and of course, technology. Now, this year, as we go into 2022, we're going to look at things just a little bit differently than we did historically. As a matter of fact, those of you who may have had your practice valued by us this year might remember filling out a COVID worksheet where we looked at your production and receipts data from 2020. We asked you how many days were you planning to be open and how many days were you actually open. We then started looking at your most recent performance, last 4 months of 2020, as well as the last quarter of 2020. And now, of course, since we're just about finished 2021, what have you done year to date? However, when we value practices, we'll still do a 3 to 4 year look back. However, when we look at 2020, we're not going to really look at that as critically as we would have in the past. So we're going to kind of discount 2020 as a one-time event. So what's going to really be important to look at a strong value is how have you done year to date, and how did you do in 2019? Are there significant differences? Are you about the same, or are you actually less than 2019? And also, we're going to start looking at the last 12 months of your performance. They call it trailing 12 months. So that's frankly what DSOs use when they value practices. However, at the end of the day, the reason there's such a variance in values, whether it's a general practitioner or a specialty practice, is where are you located and what's your earnings or cash flow? Because at the end of the day, I might be buying nice equipment, but I'm practicing at a good location, and more importantly, the practice that I'm buying is profitable. And as we look at the DSO world, they still focus on earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, EBITDA. So let's kind of jump in the pool here and talk about selling your practice. You think you're ready to pull the trigger in 2022? Well, if so, there's some questions I think that need to be answered before you really get serious about it. First of all, have you retained a financial planner? A financial planner is someone who can really give you some good, strong advice about the assets that you have, any liabilities that you might have. Will ask you questions about your lifestyle. How many years do you expect to receive that income? And all those kind of things. And they put it in a way that you can have some financial goals and targets so you actually can see visually what is going on and understand whether or not you have the financial wherewithal to retire. Unfortunately, many doctors get emotional about being a practitioner. They get upset about dealing with insurance companies. They're frustrated with staff turnover. They just have a lot of issues that say, you know what, I would just like to be a dentist. I don't want to run a business. And that sometimes drives them to make a practice sale decision. However, you can't make a really good decision on emotion. You've got to have someone sit you down with your spouse and map it all out. And if you've ever worked with a financial planner, it's like getting a comprehensive physical. Lots of tests, lots of data have to be collected, but it's well worth it to understand where you're going, because what that financial planner tells you may have an impact on A, whether you'll sell in 2022, B, if you sell in 2022, what are your expectations for retirement income? So maybe you decide to stick around for a little bit longer to kind of get to a level where you need to go. And of course, the value of your practice could be a key component. And to that point, another important item that needs to be addressed, and when our transition consultant sits down with you to talk about transition planning, they should ask you the question, is the sale of your practice a financial necessity or simply a quality of life decision? Now, the answer to either question has very broad ramifications. Let's look at the financial necessity sale. That means that you've got to get maximum value. You have to have maximum tax benefit because you need every dollar of value that you're going to receive from the sale of your practice. That's sometimes a tall order, because if your practice isn't a strong practice, maybe it has high overhead, lack of technology, older equipment, all of a sudden that could get to be a little bit of a problem. But you've got to understand that that's what's going on. Versus you want to sell your practice, and you want to sell your practice in a way that maybe your staff are taken care of, you are concerned about your patients. If you're staying in the same town where you've been practicing for your whole career, you want to find a buyer that will kind of keep your legacy around, even though maybe your name isn't on the door anymore. But you know what I'm saying. And so selling, in that case, where it's not a financial necessity, it's really, I just want to retire and enjoy the rest of my life. That's great. That sometimes is a lot easier to deal with than someone who really has to look for every nickel to really make it work when they sell their practice. So getting back to, have you had your practice valued? What do you think it's worth? And what do you think professionals like us may think it's worth if, in fact, you want to sell your practice? Because that may be very beneficial, especially if you're using a financial planner to kind of kick in that asset to see how the numbers flow. Another key element is, are you mentally ready? If you're a solo practitioner, you've been the chief cook and bottle washer for 20, 25, 30 years, and you always had the control and power. And, if you sell your practice, and particularly if you stick around for a while, that may be tough for you to deal with. And so it gets back to, you've been the doctor for many patients for a long time, and you've been the employer of staff who are very loyal to you. And so those things cross people's minds when they're thinking of selling. They just sometimes can't come to the realization that maybe it's time to retire because of these factors. And more importantly, if you are ready, what are you going to do after you sell your practice? Do you have any hobbies? Haven't you traveled much because, you never took more than a 1-week vacation because you were afraid that you might lose patients or coverage of the office, particularly if you're a solo practitioner? If there's a dental school in your area, would you like to get involved in some dental education activities? How about just enjoying your family? And of course, everything really depends on what age you are going to sell your practice. If you're going to sell your practice at the age of 60, chances are you might live to 90. That's another career. If you're 75 or 80, that's a different kind of decision. So you can see that these types of things, not just the emotional feeling of I'm sick and tired of all this business stuff, I just want to get out. You've got to really put together a solid game plan with numbers and with a lot of introspection. And for some of you who really like patient care but hate business, well, do you want to continue practicing, and for how long? Now, the DSOs have been very successful in recruiting doctors. As a matter of fact, their focus now is on younger practitioners, where they're looking for doctors in their maybe even 30s or 40s or 50s, whereby they'll buy the practice and offer all kinds of incentives, but not look for you to retire. So that's a new paradigm that many DSOs are going through in terms of what their target is. Because back in the day, when the movement started, they would look at doctors in their 60s usually, bring them in, and then they recruit them. And then after they fulfilled their number of years to be with the DSO, they retired. And many DSOs were challenged in trying to find replacement doctors, because if the owner doctor was a high producer, that could become problematic. So you can see that practicing for a while for a younger doctor is a different kind of mindset than if you're in your 60s or 70s. So if you're a later age and you just like practicing, what's going to be critical if you're a solo practitioner and I buy you out is the patient base adequate to support you, at least for maybe a day or two or three. And of course, if you're going to stay around, the compatibility with the new owner is essential. So I'm addressing this now for those doctors who are single owners, because obviously if you're in a group practice, have partner or partners, it's a different type of exit strategy than a complete sale. So the two real types of sales you have, if you're a solo owner, is a walkaway sale or a role reversal sale. So obviously, as I said just a second ago, a role reversal sale, bottom line, is all about the size of the patient base. If you got 700 patients and you kept reasonably busy, maybe you worked 3 days a week, you sold your practice to me, and I want to practice 3 or 4 days because I have a bank loan to pay, there's no way you're going to stick around, except maybe for finishing up some cases and maybe some goodwill transfer. So if the case is that you're going to be leaving sooner than later, a strong letter of introduction can be very valuable if you're retiring. So make sure those patients will return. Many young doctors say, well, if I retire, Dr. Snyder retires, all the patients that she's been seeing are going to leave. That's not true. Where else would they go? Do most patients have a second choice in their hip pocket? So when their doctor retires, they say, well, I'm not going back there again. Why wouldn't they? Unless, of course, they're a second or third generation patient, whereby they've been traveling 20, 30, 40 miles to see you, and they've known you since they were children, so they like that relationship. Those types of patients may leave. But if the majority of your patients are within driving distance or reasonable distance, why would they not give the new buyer a chance? And many purchasers don't get that concept. So that becomes really critical. So the young purchaser has one or two chances to show themselves to see if that patient is comfortable with them as their care provider. And that gets into staff. Lots of times when we sell practices, we do it in the evenings and weekends via cell phones and off-site meetings or whatever, because the doctor doesn't want their staff to know that they're thinking of retiring, even though many staff probably, if they've been with the doctor for a while, kind of know that he or she may be ending their career sooner than later. But of course, they're concerned about job loss, so that's a concern. And if the staff are going to stay, are they going to be able to work with that purchaser? If it's someone who's been an associate for 6 months to a year, that might be an easier transition than when you sell it, I buy it, but I've never ever been in the practice till after settlement. That's a different look, right? And of course, staff are always concerned if they had a very generous pension plan from you, will they get that, or will they get something in exchange? So those are some of the things that we see. Now, for those who own real estate, there is a couple of issues I want to touch on. First of all, based on your age and your overall financial picture, do you want to sell your real estate with the practice? There's something to be said about the cash flow that you can get as an owner of a building. Because if it's a single use facility and for your entire career, you've been paying yourself a rent or not even paying yourself a rent, now you have a buyer who bought your practice and they don't want to buy your building right away. Well, that's not such a bad thing because now you're getting rental income. And again, getting back to the financial planning side of it, it may well be that your financial planner says, Tom, this building is worth about 700,000. I think you should hold on to it for a while because look at the cash flow you're getting from this where you never got it before, especially if there's no debt on the building. That could be a very sweet situation. However, depending on where you are in your age and your asset mix, you may need to sell your practice to come up with enough cash, so to speak, to fund your retirement. So those are things that financial planners can really help clarify. One thing we do know that many of our buyers, particularly those who've been out for a while, maybe working as an associate 3, 4, 5 years, have paid down some of their student loans, are feeling a lot better about themselves. Why do they want to pay rent? More than likely, they would consider buying your business, and that may be a prerequisite because maybe they don't want to just buy the practice and pay rent. They'd like to build equity like you have done with your building. So those are things that need to be looked at. Obviously, if you don't sell, you become the landlord. However, many doctors who aren't ready to sell their real estate and/or the buyer isn't willing to buy the real estate right away would consider a future purchase option whereby there would be a market appraisal done at the time of sale, and hopefully that purchaser will now buy your building. On rare occasion, we run into this dilemma. Your property value is greater than the value of your practice. And that's a tough sell for a conventional purchaser because unless they have an asset base or a relative who's an investor, banks will loan money, not just for acquisition loans, but for real estate loans. But if your value is greater than your practice's value, that could become an issue. And maybe the only way for you to sell your property would be to find a private investor who would like to get rental income for a long period of time with a nice lease, multiple options for renewal. Some other issues to consider that if you are the landlord, the length of the lease must be at least identical to the number of years that the practice acquisition loan is underwritten for. So if it's a 10-year loan, it could be a 10-year lease or a 5-year with a 5-year renewal. Again, those things, the lender that you're dealing with, I should say, the practice acquisition lender for the purchaser will deal with that lease issue and make required changes if necessary. If you've never really charged rent before, you've got to know what a comparable rent is to other professional practices in your area. Some of you, for financial planning reasons, may have paid yourself an extremely high rent over the years, and that's fine. But now that it's on the market, it's got to be fair market. Let's look at all the things that need to be considered and done when we're thinking of selling a practice. We call this the anatomy of a dental practice transition. So there's lots of steps that really factor into this equation. And that's why oftentimes it takes 3 to 6 months to sell a dental practice in a good location. And if the location is in a small town or rural area, it could take a heck of a lot longer, if at all. And why does it take so long? Well, because all these steps, starting with a practice valuation, recruiting a buyer, going through all the negotiations for a letter of intent, a business offer to purchase, going to the bank, getting lending, and if there's real estate, that adds more time because now we have to deal with the landlord unless you're the owner. If it's a third party landlord, that could be interesting. So there's lots of things. In addition to which, the purchaser has a right to do due diligence. So that takes time. So when doctors call and say, I need to sell my practice in 30 days. Well, unless, it's a distress sale and the doctor's ill or something is going on where they're losing their lease in 30 days, that doctor hasn't done him or herself a favor. They should have called someone before because you can't do much in 30 days. And as we'll talk about lending, it takes a little while to get a loan too. So all these factors get thrown in the bowl and give you a recipe for a 3 to 6 month time horizon, or even up to 9 months, and sometimes even greater in outlying areas. Let's talk about lending. Uh, and for you doctors who are thinking of selling, the good news is, even though the average debt is over 300,000 for young doctors, uh, they'll still be funded. As a matter of fact, recent statistics show that 20% of young dentists don't have any debt, and another percentage, a significant percentage, have less debt than 200,000. About a third of doctors have debt over almost close to 400. So it's a wide spectrum. But even for doctors who owe $400,000, uh, based on their credit history and based on the business that they may buy, you may be surprised that banks will fund these people. So that's a myth that doctors have, and it's even worse for young dentists because they all think, well, gee, I owe 350, I'll never get a loan. That is not true. And remember, dental lenders are in the business to do what? Lend money. If they can't lend money, they can't turn a profit. And what's the sense of having a practice acquisition division if it can't make any money? So, who are their candidates? Young doctors with this average debt load. So that's one thing that a lot of people just don't understand. And the other thing that people don't understand is the failure rate. I think it's less than 2%. I don't have the most current statistics, but it's a very low number. And any lender will tell you that if they're lending money to a dentist versus a restaurant, every day of the week they'd rather lend to a doctor because they're small business people and it's pretty tough to go bankrupt. Yes, there have been bankruptcies with dentists who purchased a practice or did a practice startup. Maybe they didn't do their homework. Maybe they weren't good managers or they didn't hire good help as far as advisors, whether it's accountants or even management consultants. So, again, all these things are in the mix when we're looking at borrowing money. So, let's kind of look at what the lenders are doing right now. What we're finding, excuse me, is that most of the what we call the dental lenders are back to normal or pre-pandemic uh, lending with a few minor changes. Not too many, but a few. Most lenders now are covering 90 to 100% of current gross receipts. Now, some lenders might not go that high, but they are back to where they were, meaning that, we talked about practice values being on the high side and lenders know that. So, it's like anything else. Not every two practices are alike. Not every two dental lenders are alike. Each of them has their own underwriting guidelines. They have their underwriters, bank policies. So some lenders may be easier to work with than others. And sometimes we find one lender will approve a deal that another person turned down, and then 2 months later, the one that turned it down approved it, and the one that approved it turned it down. So we deal with lenders all the time. So it's not a black and white issue, but suffice it to say, there's lots of money out there for young doctors or established practitioners to buy another practice. Typically, lenders are still going to look at last 3 years. That would be 19, 20, and 21, and they're going to have an eye on 2020 and kind of not really consider that too greatly. But what they're going to look at is, where are you now? What have you done over the last 12 months? It's called trailing 12 months. That's what DSOs like to look at. They like to look at the last 12 months. And obviously, if you sold your practice 6 months ago, your trailing 12 months had a lot of 2020 in it. But now we're in October. So now we're looking at just a tad bit of October, Q4 of 2020. And as you go out in time, before long, it's going to be the entire year of 2021, which hopefully will be good. So lenders are still going to look at production reports. They're going to look at your recare program. They're going to look at a lot of data, some of which they didn't look at as critically, but they still are. But the bottom line is, if you have a decent practice to sell, it will get funded. Now, to the point of interest rates, which of course, in our environment, who knows, a year from now, if I do this program again, I don't know what that number will be. Could it be 5%, 6%? Have no way of telling. Suffice it to say, most of the deals that we see are between 2 and 3.5%. There are some lenders that actually have promotional campaigns for under 2% for a short period of time. So if you're a buyer, this is a great time to buy something. It's just like real estate. Even though real estate values are high, so are dental practices high. But again, if you're buying someone else's cash flow and your cost of borrowing is between 2 and 3.5%, that's a small price to pay for interest rate to buy a business that you're going to own for 20 to maybe 30 years. At least it seems that way to me. However, there are instances where interest rates could be higher than that, maybe in the 4 to 4.5% range. And that's typically situations where maybe the dental practice itself has some inherent issues, but the borrower has some issues as well. So again, the by and large, for the majority of doctors who are buying practices, the 2 to 3.5% number is reasonable. Lenders are still using a debt to income ratio of 1.25. Some lenders will require liquidity. And what does that mean? That means that the buying doctor has to show evidence of some liquid assets. And typically that could be between 5 or 10% of a loan. Not all lenders require that, but some do. Again, that's what purchasers have to do, is look at different lenders to see the best deal that they can find. Loan terms are running typically 10, but some lenders will go out to 15 years. So imagine buying a large practice as a purchaser, and you take it out to 15 years, and let's say your interest rate is 3%. That's a pretty darn good investment. So again, good times to be buying for sure. Now, the one thing that we did see, and it's not a criticism, it's just a reality, that loan underwriting is slower than it was pre-pandemic. Because pre-pandemic, we had people working in, bank buildings and everything else. The underwriting team might be together. The chief underwriter might be right down the hall, stop in, make some decisions. Now, many staff are still working remotely, and that's not efficient. And we all know when we talk to companies and try to get a hold of somebody's working out of their house. Half the time they're on a cell phone. You can't even hear them. This is just a general statement, not about lenders, but just general working with the public in businesses, because people are remote workers. So the same thing is there, where you just maybe can't get that immediate response, or maybe you have to set up a Zoom call with a team. This is underwriters and look at big deals. So again, it has slowed things down. Now, another thing that we've seen with our practice sales, particularly when you're dealing with landlords, most doctors who are selling their practice who still have an existing lease, let's say they have 1 or 2, 3 years left on the term that they've got, their attorneys would love to take them off that lease once they sell the business, because especially if it's a walk away and they're no longer there, they can't control that doctor and how well they perform and how they pay their bills or pay their rent. They can't control it. So some lenders who, got hit pretty badly, especially in the urban areas with the pandemic, commercial real estate has taken a big hit. So what we've been finding is that many of the landlords are saying, I'm not going to take my doctor off, and I'm not going to approve this lease for the new buyer unless Dr. Snyder hangs on for another year or two. So again, some doctors say, well, then I'm taking my practice off the market, the heck with it, forget it. Or because of where they are, the amount of money involved, the confidence they may have in this buyer because they think this person's a real superstar, they may just say, okay, I'll do it because I really want to get out from under. So we just mentioned that, so it's not a shock. This is something we're seeing that's really been more of an issue than it had been prior to the pandemic. Let's talk a little bit about brokers. Obviously, we broker practices, and we broker for a commission. We provide a set of services for that commission. And there are many brokers out there. There's national brokers, there's regional brokers, there's retired doctors who sold their practice to a broker and said, gee, I'd like to get 5, 6, 8, 10% commission. So now all of a sudden they become a broker. So it's a very fragmented industry. There's lots of people out there, lots of choices that you have. But if you're using a broker, we have to understand that there's a cost to that, right? However, many dental practices are completed without a broker. Oftentimes, your CPA or maybe your attorney might know of somebody and they help do the deal, and there's no commission charge. Some CPAs now have gotten into the brokerage business because they would see all the deals that they were advising on and say, gee, I have relationships with a couple of hundred of my clients. Gee, I think I'll get into the brokerage business and help my clients sell their practice, and of course charge them a commission. But still, many doctors, don't want to pay a commission. They don't see the value in it. They think it's an added expense, and so they don't use a broker. And that's a personal decision. However, using a broker sometimes is very important because maybe you have a timeline and you don't have the luxury of selling it on your own, interviewing people, putting ads, doing all the things you need to do. You need to sell it quickly. So sometimes people will use a broker for no other reason than timing. As I said before, good practices can go to 3 to 6 months. We've seen some get sold less. So timing is a big issue in terms of whether you want to use a broker or not. Sometimes we'll retain doctor clients who tried to sell it on their own for 2 years and were unsuccessful. Whether we're successful or not really depends on the quality of the practice that's listed, of course. So just like anything else in life, there's a cost and there's a benefit. So one has to decide, is it worth it to have someone get you the maximum value, help get you the maximum tax advantage, get you a kind of buyer that you'll be proud to have with your patients, and there's a transaction cost to that, and that's a commission. So those are things that are subjective, but you have to really consider it in your calculus of whether or not you want to use a broker. Now, some brokers offer what's called dual representation, where both the buyer and the seller will pay a fee. Nonetheless, we don't do dual representation, but some brokers do. And essentially, a broker gets paid a commission. So one has to decide, can it be done perfectly when both people are paying the same person, or knowing full well that if I'm selling your practice, you're paying me a commission, uh, and I get paid when I get the deal done. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to work with the buyer, because if I don't work with the buyer, maybe that buyer will get ticked off at me and go to another practice, and you just lost your sale. So that's not smart business. So obviously we work with the buyers. We help them get loans. We explain things to them. We put them in touch with an accountant or a lawyer, particularly a dental accountant or dental lawyer if they need one. But we still feel that we have a fiduciary responsibility to one person. So that's why we don't do dual representations. Obviously, all brokers, whether it's a single broker or a big company, must maintain confidentiality. Non-disclosure agreements are a must. And so we have all our purchasers sign a non-disclosure agreement. They go to our website and they sign it off, and they're not allowed to talk about the business, anything about that business, except to their spouses and or their advisors. Obviously, one of the reasons you go to a broker is you're assuming that that broker has an inventory of qualified purchasers. We try to screen our purchasers before we get them to meet doctors. We make sure that they're capable of getting financing, because what's the sense of spending 2 or 3 months back and forth with a purchaser, and there's a chemistry now between buyer and seller, and you find out, 60, 90 days later that this person couldn't get a loan. Well, that doesn't do anybody any good. A lot of time is wasted, and sellers really get upset. So, they got to be screened to the degree that they're qualified to be able to get financing. Brokers have established relationships with lenders because that's who they deal with, particularly the dental lenders. So that's an important component, because if a young doctor walks into a local bank and says, I want to buy a dental practice, a lot of local banks aren't used to financing dental businesses, and they'll look at that dental business like they would a fast food business or tire shop or whatever else, as opposed to a professional practice, whereas dentistry is kind of a unique service. So therefore, brokers have these relationships, and that sometimes helps push a deal through. Obviously, you want to deal with a broker who understands the local market. Uh, Unless they have databases, it's pretty tough to know every part of the country. So that's important. So a company that has a lot of brokers around the country is in a better position probably to advise as to what the fair market value is of a practice. The first document that a broker is going to give you after the non-disclosure agreement is a listing agreement. And that listing agreement can either be exclusive or non-exclusive. An exclusive listing agreement means that that broker gets paid, even though the broker did not introduce the buyer. It could be a relative, Could be someone else that is not known to that broker, but if it's exclusive and that person buys it, then the broker has a right to the commission. Versus in a non-exclusive relationship, unless the broker introduces the buyer, there's no responsibility to pay. Most brokers, by the way, use exclusive arrangements. Length of contract term is another key point. You know, for doctors who say, well, I'll give you a 30-day deal, that really doesn't work. We've done some of shorter duration than 12 months. Typically, we find 12 months with renewable terms after that. So again, how long do you want to work with that broker? You may want to negotiate. You know, broker gives you a 12-month contract. You say, you know what, if you can't sell this thing in 6 months, you know, maybe my practice isn't sellable, or maybe I need to find another broker. That's all negotiable. Practice valuations, are they for free or is a fee charged? And what is that valuation? Is it a one-page sheet with a spreadsheet, or is it a comprehensive document with 3 methods or more, 30, 40 pages, really documented information to help set the price? Sometimes doctors will say, I don't want to pay for it. And we'll say, okay, if we sell your practice, you'll pay us that fee for the valuation out of the commission charge. So considerations are exclusions. You know, sometimes doctors will have worked with an associate in the community and say, listen, you can sell my practice, but if Dr. Snyder buys this practice, I've known Tom for a while, and even though he's not interested now, he may be. Well, those are things that have to be negotiated. How many exclusions? I remember one time years ago, the doctor in New York State gave me the list of the county dental society membership as an exclusion. Obviously, we didn't accept that. Is your broker engaged? You know, brokers are paid to find a buyer, and they should do more. Or do they just meet you at settlement and say, well, I'll give you names of accountants and attorneys and, you know, get the deal done and let me know the day you're settling and I'll show up and get my check? Do brokers provide sample contracts, the closing documents that are, and we're going to talk about those shortly. And so that's important because that's part of the value you get for paying a commission. Meaning, do you get a practice purchase agreement sample contract? And excuse me, if you're going to remain as an employee, will you get an employment agreement sample contract provided? Does your broker work with advisors? Meaning, do they work actively with the CPAs and attorneys just to keep the deal moving? We like to be in control. We like to have the responsibility of getting it done because the seller doesn't want to spend months of negotiations back and forth. Maybe a broker whose experience can help accelerate that timeline and get things taken care of. Obviously, as I said before, assisting purchasers in obtaining financing is a must. So let's talk about another document that you'll be signing if you sell your practice. It's called a practice purchase agreement. There's so many things that need to be done when you're transferring equity, selling your practice. And this is just one small snapshot of the various tasks that have to be done when you're selling your business. So we provide what we call a pre-closing checklist for the buyer and the seller. And you can see the seller checks off boxes, the purchaser checks off boxes, both have to do it. Again, there's so many things. That's not an all-inclusive list. It just gives you an idea of the many things that need to be done when you're selling your practice. One of the big things that's important is the allocation of the purchase price. And we'll talk about that shortly. How about the collection of the accounts receivable? Because the accounts receivable typically are not part of a practice's value and belong to that seller. So is the buyer going to collect the AR? And if so, are they going to charge a percentage for collection costs? Obviously, if the purchaser is buying the AR, there should be discounting based on the age of the receivable, obviously, 30, 60, 60, 90, 90, 120 plus. Are there any credit balances patients have, and are they going to be taken care of before settlement? Because if not, then the patient thinks, well, you know, I paid for something, I didn't get it done. You owe me $2,000 worth of dentistry. Now the buyer has to deal with that. That's not a very good thing to have happen. So we try to disclose all that and get them handled before. How about work in progress? You know, it needs to be listed, and there should be a timeline on when that's going to be done. How about staffing and unused vacation time? Uh, is there a pension contribution still due? All these little things can need to be disclosed and researched. Uh, how about remakes and what are the contingencies? What's the timeline when those remakes can occur? Usually it's 1 year or less. And who's going to perform those services? If the if the seller is still around, yes, maybe, but if they're retired, who's going to do them? And there should be compensation for that. How about family care protocol? Usually we look up to 10 to 15 family members for free dentistry. How about any contingencies? Is an escrow account required? And if there's going to be post-sale seller employment, what are the timelines? What's the compensation, etc. Let's talk for a minute about tax allocation issues. Now, obviously, this whole section could be thrown out the window if tax code changes in 2022. But right now, we'll just look at taxes as is. And no one knows what capital gains rate may go to or not. So let's look at the current situation. When somebody sells a practice, typically it's called an asset sale. That means the tangible assets, equipment, inventory, and leaseholds, if applicable. And the intangible assets were most notably most of the value of a dental practice's goodwill, a slight allocation to restrictive covenant and patient list, and in some cases, particularly a specialty practice and or multiple location practice, the phone number becomes an important asset. So when it's time to sell the practice, who gets the benefit? Well, obviously the seller wants to maximize their capital gains treatment. If they're selling a practice for $800,000, they'd like to get most of that as a capital gain, even though it's not always 100%. We usually find 75 to 80%, maybe a little bit higher with older equipment, is a good ratio in favor of goodwill. But we also find that if the purchaser had a pretty sharp accountant, they're looking for all kinds of ways that they can get more write-offs for their client. Because if as you'll see in a minute, if the entire transaction is goodwill, it's great for the seller, but it's a little more costly for the buyer, even though they get a write-off. It's just a timing issue. So when we look at the allocation for the seller, goodwill is capital gains, equipment supplies, the covenant, and deferred comp. Sometimes we see that is ordinary income. And based on what state you're practicing in, that could be a big number. Also, patient list is considered capital gains. Sometimes purchasers' advisors like the doctor to sign a consulting agreement so they can get additional write-off. The consulting agreement can be written off in the year that the money was paid, so that's a great write-off for the buyer. Not so good for the seller because it's ordinary income. Leaseholds are ordinary, and then depreciation recapture happens on occasions when a seller purchases equipment. Let's say they purchased some really nice equipment 3 years ago, and they did a Section 179, so they wrote it off all in 1 year. And depreciation recapture requires that to be recalculated, and that really means, in plain English, that additional tax needs to be paid. So when we look at the purchaser's tax allocation timelines, as I said, the goodwill, it's written off, but it takes 15 years. Equipment, 5 to 7 years. Consulting agreement, 1 year. A patient list, 15, and restrictive covenant. So, like I said, most of our transactions are 75 to 80% in the goodwill area, and the rest is a blend of the others. So, in closing, let's just talk for a second for those doctors who, may not be fortunate enough to sell their practice as a going concern. And obviously, with COVID, we had a lot of these types of sales because doctors just wanted to close their doors. They wanted to get something for their practice. So we tried to find a way to make that work by selling the patient list. So there's a couple of different ways that can be done. First is called a production or revenue acquisition valuation method, whereby you pay a fixed percentage of revenue from any of the seller's patients who come to the practice of the purchaser over a period of time. Typically, in this particular method, a down payment is required, and then the value also sometimes may be higher in this type of a method because if we're just getting an initial down payment and the seller is getting paid over time, usually a 2 to 3 year period, a percentage of receipts from patients that go to the purchaser's practice, who's taking all the risk? It's the selling doctor. So we try to get close to 75% of last year's gross receipts as a value, even though that may not be paid. If the patients don't come, the doctor who's buying that practice doesn't pay the 75% of last year's gross. If they have to pay that, that means they got a lot of patients and they're probably doing very well financially. In this particular method, payments are usually made on a quarterly basis. And most importantly, the seller has an option for an annual audit just to make sure the accounting is in good shape. And of course, if the purchaser pays the maximum value, it's a big win. It's a win for the seller and a win for the buyer. Now, another way of doing it without getting involved in percentages over time is to take the average of the last 3 years' gross receipts, divide that by the number of patients having at least one patient visit in the last 18 months, come up with a per record fee, and pay the price over a 24-month period. And that record fee is paid for after the second visit. So again, these are just two ways that we've used to try to help a doctor get something for their career's investment in the dental profession. It's not always a big number, but it's better than just closing the doors and not getting anything for your life's work. So tonight I covered a lot of ground, as I promised. I hope that this was helpful as we're entering the end of 2021 and looking over the horizon to 2022. And hopefully you'll take some of these points to heart so that you can develop your action plan and begin your practice transition plan. So it was a pleasure to join. And if you have any questions on practice valuations or transition planning or practice sales, anything like that, please reach out to us at henryscheinppt.com or at ppt@henryschein.com. Our number is 800-988-5674. So again, on behalf of Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions, I thank you for taking the time to join me this evening, and I hope that I motivated some of you, clarified some myths, gave you some critical thinking material, and enjoy the rest of this year. And hopefully 2021 will have been a banner year considering where you came from in 2020. And for a lot of you, maybe making that big decision to move forward in 2022 would be best for your interest. So again, thank you and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you, Tom, for another excellent webinar. As a thank you for attending, all attendees will receive the recording of this webinar via email in the next week. For more Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope to see you back here soon. Have a great night.